I remember the light. That's what haunts me most, not the darkness that came after, but the light beforehand, the ordinary amber glow of the forge deck's lumens reflecting off brushed steel, the way my breath fogged in the recycled air of the transport ship, benediction of toil, the simple weight of my wrench in my hand. I was nobody, Enginseer third-class Valen Koreth, assigned to monitor plasma conduit integrity on a merchantman hauling textiles and grain to the shrine world of Ophidian Tertius, 26 standard years old, unremarkable service record, no family to speak of, raised in the creches of hive praxis like 10 billion others. I remember thinking, as I calibrated the pressure sensors that morning, that my life was small but sufficient, contained, safe within the Emperor's ordered cosmos. The klaxons started at 0600 ship time, third watch, 7 weeks into our voyage through the Corvus Strait. Not the routine alarm for shift change or minor malfunction, the shrieking, bone-rattling howl that meant hull breach. That meant the Geller field was compromised. That meant something had gone catastrophically, impossibly wrong. I dropped my wrench. It clattered against the deck plating with a sound I can still hear, a tiny music of metal that meant the end of everything I knew. The emergency lumens bathed the corridor in blood-red light as I ran toward my muster station, and I remember the smell, the sudden sharp tang of ozone and something else, something sweet and rotten like flowers left too long in a tomb. The ship shuddered, not the gentle thrumming of the plasma drives or the occasional jolt of warp turbulence, but a violent sexual shiver that ran through every rivet and weld, as if the benediction were a living thing experiencing violation. I heard screaming from the aft sections, Elas fire, the distinctive crack of shipboard shotguns, then other sounds that didn't belong in reality, high-pitched laughter like breaking glass, a wet tearing. That might have been metal or might have been flesh, and beneath it all, a thrumming drone that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I never made it to my station. The corridor intersection ahead of me erupted in a cascade of sparks and shredded metal, and through the smoke they came. I had seen picked captures in the training modules, grainy images accompanied by stern warnings from the Munitorum lecturers, Xenos threats, hostile entities, maintain vigilance, report any contact immediately. But the captures were flat, sanitized, drained of the essential horror of their reality. These things were tall, impossibly tall, their movements too fluid, too quick, like serpents given humanoid form. Their armor was baroque, edged with blades that served no tactical purpose, covered in hooks and thorns that existed only to cause suffering. But it was their faces that broke something in my mind, beautiful and terrible, with eyes like chips of obsidian that held no light, no recognition of my humanity, only a bright predatory hunger that saw me as something less than vermin, something to be used. I ran. Emperor, forgive me. I didn't try to fight. I turned and ran back down the corridor, my boots slipping on deck, plating suddenly slick with something I couldn't identify. Behind me I heard them laughing, those high crystalline voices expressing genuine amusement at my terror. They weren't chasing me with urgency, they were playing. I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my lungs that they could catch me whenever they wanted, that my flight was entertainment, that my fear was the point. The ship was dying around me. I passed the body of Enginseer First Class Markov, her augmetics torn out with surgical precision, her remaining organic components arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. I passed a barricade where 3 armsmen had tried to make a stand. Their weapons lay discarded, pristine, unfired. The armsmen themselves were gone, but the walls bore long gouges, as if they'd clawed at the metal as they were dragged away. I could hear the benediction groaning through her superstructure, could feel her list growing more pronounced as her stabilizers failed or were disabled. I found a maintenance shaft and threw myself into it, crawling through the narrow tunnel with my shoulders scraping against the conduit housings. The shaft was barely wide enough for a human body, far too small for those elongated Xenos frames. I allowed myself a moment of hope, bitter and small, as I pulled myself forward on my elbows. The shaft was completely dark. Emergency power hadn't reached this auxiliary system, and I navigated by touch and memory, counting junction points following the slight downward grade toward the lower decks, where perhaps the escape pods might still be functional. My hand touched something wet. In the absolute darkness I froze, my fingers exploring the substance coating the shaft floor. It was warm. Too warm. Viscous, but not quite thick enough to be oil. The smell hit me a moment later. Copper and meat and human waste. Someone else had tried to hide here. Someone else had been found. I didn't find a body, just the residue of what had been done to it, and in that darkness I experienced my first true understanding of what capture meant. They hadn't killed whoever had crawled into this shaft. They'd taken their time. In this confined space where there was no room to resist, they'd performed some artistic horror that left only biological runoff behind. I vomited silently, my stomach heaving until there was nothing left. Then I kept crawling, because there was nothing else to do. I think I was crying. I'm not sure. Everything had taken on a strange distant quality, as if I were watching myself from outside my body, as if this were happening to someone else. I emerged into a cargo hold on Deck 7, stumbling through the access panel into blessed open space. The hold was vast, designed to accommodate bulk freight. Containers, now mostly empty as we'd been on the return leg of our route. The overhead lumens flickered intermittently, casting wild shadows across the deck. I could see the far bulkhead, perhaps 200 meters away, where the cargo bay doors led to the lifeboat stations. I could see freedom. I could see survival. The tall figure stepped out from behind a freight loader with the casual grace of someone who'd been waiting patiently. Male, I thought, though their kind's dimorphism wasn't like ours. Armor the color of midnight, edged in blades that wept something luminescent. Face like a death mask carved from ivory, all sharp angles and cruel beauty. He wasn't alone. 3 others emerged from concealment points I hadn't even noticed, moving to cut off every exit without hurry, without concern. They knew I had nowhere to go. He spoke. I didn't understand the words. Their language was all hard consonants and liquid vowels like poetry written in razors. But I understood the tone. Amusement, satisfaction. The tone you'd use when finding exactly what you'd been looking for. One of his companions carried a device, a crystalline construct that pulsed with inner light, and when he activated it I felt something wrap around my limbs, invisible bonds that burned where they touched skin. I fell, my legs collapsing beneath me, and lay on the cold deck unable to move anything below my neck. They approached without haste. The tall one, I would learn his designation later, though I cannot bring myself to write it even now, knelt beside me and studied my face with those lightless eyes. He reached out one gauntleted hand and traced a line down my cheek, almost tender, and the edge of his armor opened my skin in a precise, shallow cut. Blood ran warm down my jaw. He collected a drop on one finger and tasted it, his expression unchanging, making some evaluation I couldn't comprehend. Then he nodded to his companions, and I felt hands, too many hands, too strong, too cold even through their armor, lifting me. I screamed then. I screamed as they carried me through the dying ship, past corpses and wreckage and walls painted with fluids that had once been people I'd worked beside for months. I screamed as they brought me to the breach point, where their vessel had attached itself to ours like a parasite, the wound in the Benediction's hull still glowing with whatever cutting technology they'd employed. I screamed as they carried me across the threshold into their ship, and the difference hit me like a physical blow. The air was different, perfumed with something that made my head swim and my stomach clench. The walls were alive with moving shadows and lights that followed no human spectrum, and the sounds were wet and organic, despite the obvious technology surrounding us. The screaming stopped when they sealed something across my mouth, a membrane that adhered to my skin and prevented sound but not breath. I could still see, still hear, still smell and feel. They wanted me conscious. They wanted me aware. That was the first lesson. Unconsciousness was a mercy they would not grant. They brought me to a chamber. I couldn't call it a hold or a cell, because those words implied purpose I could understand. The walls curved in ways that hurt to look at, covered in what might have been art or might have been trophies or might have been both. Other prisoners were there, perhaps a dozen, suspended in frameworks of that same crystalline technology that held me. I recognized Ensign Keller from the command deck. Her uniform torn, her eyes wide but unfocused, her body bearing evidence of attentions I couldn't process. I recognized 2 cargo handlers whose names I'd never learned, both male, both weeping continuously though they made no sound. I recognized others I'd passed in corridors, shared meals with in the crew commons, existed alongside in the comfortable anonymity of shipboard life. They arranged me in my own framework, the invisible bonds, spreading my arms and legs, tilting me at an angle that left me vulnerable but able to observe the chamber, able to observe them as they worked on the others. I learned later that this was intentional. The watching was part of the process, the helpless witnessing was its own form of violation. They wanted us to see what they did. They wanted us to understand what awaited us. They wanted fear to season us properly. The tall one approached Ensign Keller. He carried instruments, delicate things that gleamed like surgical steel but moved in his hands as if semi-alive. He began to work on her, and I cannot describe what I witnessed without breaking something in myself that remains broken. She was still alive when he finished. She was still conscious, still aware, still herself in some essential way despite what had been done to her body. He had changed her without granting the mercy of death or madness. He had made her into something new while keeping her trapped inside to experience the transformation. Then he moved to the next prisoner, and the next. Each time the process was different. Each time he created something unique. Each time his companions watched and occasionally made comments in their blade language that might have been critique or appreciation. I hung in my framework and watched and could not look away because the bonds prevented even the closing of my eyelids. I think I went somewhere else in my mind for a while. I think I stopped being entirely present, but some part of me remained, some kernel of awareness that recorded everything with the helpless precision of a picked recorder, filing away images and sounds and smells that would never leave me. The ship shuddered into motion at some point, the benediction presumably stripped of anything valuable and left to drift or burn. We were moving through the warp. I could feel it in the wrongness of the air, the way distances seemed negotiable, the sounds that came from the walls that might have been outside or might have been inside my own skull. Time became difficult to track. The chamber had no chronometers, no watch markers, no routine that would indicate the passage of hours or days. They came when they wanted. They worked when inspiration struck. Between their visits we hung in silence, unable even to comfort each other with words, alone together in our suspension. I think it was the 4th visit, though I cannot be certain, when they took their first interest in me. The tall one approached my framework and studied me again with that same clinical attention he'd given Ensign Keller. He ran his instruments along my body without breaking skin, making measurements, calculating tolerances. He seemed dissatisfied with something, spoke sharply to one of his companions who manipulated the crystalline control device. My framework rotated, showing me to him from different angles. He made a sound that might have been thoughtful. Then he left, chose someone else instead, the cargo handler, the younger one who couldn't have been more than 18 standard. I watched them transform him into something that wept blood from surfaces that should never weep. I watched them keep him alive through it. I watched them take pleasure in their precision, and I felt something worse than fear. I felt disappointed that they hadn't chosen me. I felt jealous of the attention given to the cargo handler. I felt ashamed that I'd been passed over, found wanting, deemed unworthy even of their terrible regard. That was the second lesson. They could make you complicit in your own degradation. They could twist your mind until you craved what you should flee, until you measured your value by the quality of suffering inflicted upon you. I don't know how long we traveled. The warp plays games with duration, stretches minutes into hours and compresses days into moments. We lost prisoners. Some died despite their keeper's skill. Some were taken away and didn't return. Some simply vanished from their frameworks during the periods when we were left alone. New prisoners arrived occasionally, dragged into the chamber already marked, already partially broken. Once they brought a space marine, a warrior of the Emperor's Adeptus Astartes in the colors of a chapter I didn't recognize. I felt hope then, bright and painful, certain that he would break free, would kill our captors, would save us through the superhuman might bred into his enhanced flesh. I watched them take him apart. Literally, piece by piece, organ by organ, removing his implants and altered biology with surgical fascination. He lived through it far longer than any human could have, his enhanced physiology refusing death even as they reduced him to component parts. They were delighted by him, all of them gathering to observe and participate, their usual, casual cruelty replaced by genuine enthusiasm. When they finally let him die, or when his body finally failed beyond their ability to sustain, they seemed almost regretful. That night, or what passed for night in that timeless place, I heard Ensign Keller making sounds through her sealed mouth, a rhythmic keening that might have been prayer, or might have been the last shred of her sanity finally tearing loose. The transition from warp to real space was violent, the ship lurching with a force that made the frameworks swing. I heard what might have been docking clamps engaging, felt the subtle change in gravity and air pressure that indicated we'd reached some destination. Our captors came for all of us, releasing the frameworks and herding us, those who could still walk, through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, past chambers where I glimpsed horrors that made our own experiences seem almost gentle by comparison. The ones who couldn't walk were dragged, their bodies leaving trails on floors that absorbed the fluids with organic eagerness. We emerged into vastness, a city, but calling it that feels like calling a cathedral a building. Technically true, but failing to capture the essential. Nature. Spires that clawed at a sky the color of bruises. Architecture that seemed to writhe at the edge of vision. Streets lit by captured stars suspended in fields of force. And everywhere, the evidence of their culture, suffering elevated to art, pain refined into entertainment, cruelty as the foundation of their entire civilization. They brought us to a market. I understood then that we were merchandise, that our journey had been simply transport, that everything done to us aboard the ship had been preparation and evaluation. They were sorting us, categorizing us based on the qualities they'd discovered through their attentions. Ensign Keller was led away by a figure robed in flayed skin, whose face I couldn't look at directly. The cargo handler was purchased by something that might have been female, dressed in blades, her expression hungry in ways I'd never imagined hunger could exist. Others went to different buyers, their fates determined by transaction and taste. I was not sold, not that day. The tall one kept me, led me through streets where the architecture moaned, and citizens moved with predatory grace, brought me to a structure that might have been a residence or a gallery or both. Inside, the walls were lined with alcoves, and in each alcove was a human, each modified in unique ways, each a testament to their captor's artistry. He added me to his collection. My alcove was small, barely large enough to stand or recline, its walls the color of old bone, the opening sealed with a membrane that allowed air and dim light but nothing else. I could see out, could observe the corridor beyond, could watch when he brought visitors to display his works, could hear their commentary in that blade language as they evaluated his technique. I could see the alcoves across from mine, could make eye contact with a woman suspended in crystal across the hall, could watch the man 2 positions down slowly lose coherence as his modifications progressed beyond what his mind could tolerate. Time resumed its measured passage, marked now by routine. He came for me every 3rd day by my count, though I had no way to verify. Each time he took me to his work chamber, each time he added something new, a modification here, an adjustment there, each change calculated to maximize sensation while maintaining viability. He never spoke to me, never acknowledged me as anything but canvas. His instruments were cold, his touch was colder. The pain was almost irrelevant. I learned to exist beside it rather than within it, to partition my consciousness so that what happened to my body was merely something observed rather than experienced. He was building towards something. I could sense it in the increasing frequency of his attentions, the growing complexity of his modifications, the way he would step back after each session and study me with an expression that might have been anticipation. He was preparing me for some final transformation, some ultimate expression of his craft. I should have been terrified. I was numb. In my alcove between his sessions I had nothing to do but think. The membrane allowed me to see but not interact. I could observe his other works, could catalogue their variations, could trace the evolution of his technique through the gallery of suffering he'd accumulated. I tried to hold on to who I'd been, Valen Korath, Inginsia, loyal servant of the Omnisia and the God Emperor. I tried to remember the forged deck of the benediction, the simple satisfaction of maintained machinery, the small dignity of competent work. But those memories felt increasingly abstract, like stories told about someone else, a character in a history I'd once read rather than my own past. The woman across from me died on what I estimated to be my 47th day. Not from her modifications, she'd been sustaining those reasonably well, but from simple despair. I watched her stop eating when they fed us, watched her stop drinking, watched her gaze grow. Distant, and then empty. They removed her after 3 days, replacing her with a new acquisition, a man in the tattered uniform of the Imperial Navy who spent his first week weeping continuously. He stopped weeping eventually. They always stopped eventually. I began to understand their culture through observation and context. Everything I witnessed suggested a civilization built entirely on the infliction and experience of suffering, where pain was currency and cruelty was art, and the absolute degradation of lesser beings was the highest form of expression. They were ancient beyond human comprehension, sophisticated in ways that made imperial high culture seem crude, and utterly, completely devoid of anything resembling mercy or compassion. They had refined evil into a science and practiced it with the dedication of true artists. The worst part, and I hesitate to confess this though I am long past shame, was the adaptation. The human mind is resilient in terrible ways, finding normalcy even in nightmare, establishing routine even in chaos. I began to measure my days by his visits, to anticipate them almost eagerly because they represented change in an existence otherwise static. I began to take strange pride in how well I endured his attentions, how completely I could disassociate during his work. I began to see my fellow captives not as comrades in suffering, but as comparative subjects, measuring my modifications against theirs, wondering if his technique was improving or declining. That was the third lesson. Given enough time, enough consistency of horror, the mind will normalize anything. Hell becomes ordinary. The impossible becomes routine. Suffering becomes simply the texture of existence. He began bringing other practitioners to examine me. They would stand in small groups before my alcove, discussing me in their blade language, occasionally reaching through the membrane to touch a particular modification or test a response. I understood I was approaching completion, that whatever he'd been building me toward was nearly finished. The visits to his work chamber became longer, more complex, his instruments cutting deeper, changing more fundamental aspects of my biology. I remember the day with perfect clarity, though by then I'd lost count of how long I'd been in his collection. He came for me alone, without the usual assistance, and led me not to his work chamber but to a different space, larger, more formal, with raised seating arranged in tiers around a central floor. An amphitheater. An audience was gathering, dozens of them, taking positions in the seating, their attention focused on the empty floor where he positioned me. This was to be his masterwork, his demonstration, the culmination of all the preparation and modification. He circled me slowly, making final adjustments with instruments that sparked and hummed. The audience waited in perfect silence, their collective anticipation palpable. He began the final transformation. I cannot describe it in terms that would preserve my sanity or yours. Enough to say that he was turning me into something new, something that had never existed before, something that existed purely to experience and express suffering in ways natural biology couldn't achieve. He was making me into a work of living art, a testament to his skill, a creature that would stand in his gallery as proof of his mastery. And the horror, the true horror that still wakes me screaming, is that part of me was grateful. Part of me was honored to be chosen for such attention, to be the canvas for his masterpiece, to be elevated from mere captive to finished work. He had broken something in me so completely that I could feel pride even as he unmade everything I had been. The transformation took hours. The audience watched in rapt attention, occasionally offering comments that he acknowledged with slight nods or adjustments to his technique. Pain had long since lost meaning. I existed in a state beyond pain, where nerve signals were simply information, where the dissolution of self was merely a technical process to be observed. I could feel my consciousness fragmenting, pieces of Valen Koreth falling away like shed skin, something else emerging in the hollow he created. He was nearly finished when the disruption began. At first it was just a tremor, a slight vibration that ran through the amphitheater's structure. The audience noticed, their attention shifting from me to the environment, their expressions showing something I'd never seen on their faces, uncertainty. The tremor intensified, became a shudder, became a full seismic shock that cracked the walls and sent decorative elements crashing from their mountings. Alarms began shrieking, a sound completely unlike anything I'd heard in their city, harsh, urgent, conveying genuine emergency. The audience rose as one, moving toward the exits with that same fluid grace, but notably increased speed. My captor hesitated over me, his instruments still active, his work incomplete. I could see the calculation in his eyes, abandon the project or risk completing it despite the chaos. The ceiling ruptured, not from structural failure, but from deliberate breach, the material peeling back to reveal sky, and something descending through it. Something massive, armored, bearing the Aquila. An Imperial dropship, its weapons already firing, last bolts and missiles streaking into the amphitheater in a storm of sanctified destruction. My captor ran. left me there on the floor, his masterwork incomplete, his triumph abandoned. The amphitheater was collapsing, portions of the seating crashing down, fires spreading with unnatural speed through their living architecture. I lay unable to move, the modifications he'd made leaving me with altered physiology that no longer responded to familiar commands. Armored figures descended on grav lines, human figures, warriors in the carapace plate of Imperial stormtroopers. They swept through the amphitheater with practiced efficiency, weapons barking, cleansing everything with blessed promethium. One approached me, and I saw his face through his visor, young, determined, disgusted by what he saw. He raised his bolt pistol. I tried to speak, tried to identify myself as human, as imperial, as savable. But my mouth no longer formed human sounds, and what emerged was something else, something that made him recoil. I saw the decision in his eyes, saw him recognize me as Xenos work, as corruption, as something that couldn't be saved and shouldn't be preserved. Emperor's mercy, he said, and I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Another voice, sharp with authority, hold fire, priority retrieval, all human adjacent specimens for inquisitorial processing. His pistol lowered fractionally. He spoke into his vox, received confirmation, then gestured to his squad. They surrounded me, their weapons trained on my modified form, clearly uncertain whether I represented threat or victim. A Medicae specialist approached, his auspex clicking and whirring as he scanned what I'd become. Throne, he breathed. He's still human, mostly. Enough of the baseline genome remains for potential recovery, but the modifications... He trailed off, his expression behind his rebreather mask unreadable. They loaded me onto a grav stretcher, restraints snapping into place across limbs that no longer bent in human configurations. Around us the city was burning. I could see through the ruptured ceiling that multiple Imperial vessels were prosecuting an orbital assault, that entire districts were collapsing under bombardment, that whatever operation had brought them here was massive in scale. A rescue mission, or perhaps simple retribution. Perhaps both. The extraction was chaos. They carried me and dozens of other recovered prisoners through streets that fought back, where the architecture itself attempted to trap or kill us, where inhabitants emerged to defend their territory with weapons. That violated physical law. I watched stormtroopers die in ways their armor should have prevented, watched the city itself devour some of my rescuers, but the Imperium had committed overwhelming force, and overwhelming force prevailed through sheer, brutal insistence. They brought us aboard a cruiser, the Adamant Resolve, and immediately separated the recovered prisoners into categories. Those likely to survive, those requiring extensive rehabilitation, and those too corrupted for any hope of recovery. I was classified in the second category, though I heard Medicae staff debating whether I should be moved to the third. They installed me in a medical bay, my stretcher locked into position, fresh restraints supplementing those already in place. An inquisitor came to interview me. I never learned his name, he never offered it, and I was in no position to ask. He stood beside my stretcher and studied what I'd become with eyes that had witnessed every variety of human experience and found nothing surprising anymore. "Can you understand me?" he asked, his high Gothic precisely articulated. I managed a sound that might have been affirmative. My vocal cords had been modified, could no longer produce clear speech, but I retained enough control for basic communication. "Your name, rank, and posting." I tried to dredge up those details from memory that felt centuries old rather than months. Eventually forced out sounds that approximated Valen Korith and Benediction of Toil. He consulted a data slate. The Benediction of Toil was reported missing 3 months ago, presumed lost to warp predation. "You're confirming you were crew?" Affirmative sound. "You were taken by the Drukhari. You were held in Commorragh. You were subjected to modification and torture. not questions, statements, each one requiring my confirmation, building a legal record. I confirmed each as best I could. The modifications are extensive. The tech priests have examined you. They believe approximately 40% of your original biology has been replaced or altered, much of it in ways that replicate Xenos technology. He paused, letting that sink in. This represents potential heretic contamination. It represents exposure to forbidden technology. It represents possible compromise by Xenos influence. I understood where this was going, understood that my rescue might simply be a slower, more bureaucratic death than the stormtrooper's bolt pistol would have delivered. However, he continued, you retain human cognition, you retain imperial identity. The biologist adepts believe the changes, while extensive, were inflicted rather than chosen. You are victim rather than heretic. Another pause. Probably. He made notations on his data slate. You will be remanded to a Mechanicus facility for assessment and possible reconstruction. This will take years. It will be extraordinarily painful. There is no guarantee of success, and even if successful, you will never be fully human again. You will never return to your previous life. You will live under permanent observation, your every action monitored for signs of corruption or relapse. He looked at me directly. Alternatively, I can offer the Emperor's peace right now. A bolt shell to the brain, immediate cessation, your soul released to whatever judgment awaits. No pain, no uncertainty, no years of reconstructive agony, with no promise of restoration. He drew his sidearm, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship inlaid with devotional script. Choose. I had perhaps 30 seconds to make the most important decision I would ever make. To accept death cleanly, escaping what I'd become and what I'd experienced, trusting the Emperor's mercy in whatever lay beyond, or to endure more suffering, more years of pain and reconstruction, clinging to existence in a form that was no longer truly human, forever marked by what had been done to me. I chose life. Emperor, forgive me, I chose life. The Mechanicus facility was on a moon orbiting a dead world, a complex of laboratories and surgical theaters staffed by tech priests who saw flesh as simply another material to be worked. They studied me for weeks before beginning reconstruction, mapping every modification, understanding what had been done before attempting to undo it. The head of the project, a janitor named Calixus 7, explained that they couldn't simply reverse the changes. Too much time had passed. Too much integration had occurred. Instead, they would have to find a new baseline, a stable configuration that incorporated both human and Xenos elements into something viable. You will be something unprecedented, he told me through his Vox grill, his organic eyes, the only human feature visible in his augmented face, studying me with scientific fascination, a hybrid of imperial and alien biology, forced to coexistence through necessity, fascinating from a research perspective, unfortunate from a human one. The reconstructions began. Surgeries lasting days, my consciousness sustained throughout because anesthesia interacted unpredictably with my altered physiology. I felt them cutting, rebuilding, replacing. I felt them argue over approaches, debate techniques, consult forbidden texts for procedures that orthodox Mechanicus theology forbade. I was kept conscious through all of it, my awareness preserved so I could report any complications, any unexpected interactions, any signs of rejection or failure. Years passed. I lost count after the first dozen major surgeries. Between procedures, I was housed in a cell that was half medical bay, half containment unit, monitored constantly by servitors and Auspex arrays. Other prisoners were brought to the facility occasionally, other survivors of Drukhari captivity, individuals modified by different practitioners in different ways. We never interacted directly, but I could observe them being transported through the corridors, could see in their altered forms the same stories of suffering and survival. Some died during reconstruction. Their biology couldn't tolerate the reversals, or complications arose that even the tech priest's skill couldn't resolve. I attended their deaths through the facility's surveillance feeds. The janitor insisted I observe, claiming it was important I understand the risks, the stakes, the narrow margin between successful reconstruction and fatal failure. I think he wanted me afraid. I think he believed fear would make me more compliant, more willing to endure the necessary pain. He was wrong about fear. I'd exhausted my capacity for it in that city, in that alcove, watching myself transformed into living art. What I felt was determination, cold, bitter, absolute. I would survive this not because I valued life, but because I refused to grant them the victory of my death. Every day I continued existing was a defiance of what they'd tried to make me. Every surgery I survived was proof that Commorragh, however changed, however diminished, still persisted. The janitor began to notice the change in me. I could hear it in his questions during the examination sessions, see it in the way he studied me with increased attention. I was becoming something other than a patient to him. I was becoming a subject of particular interest, a case study in human resilience and adaptation. He started bringing colleagues to observe me, presenting my case at conferences, publishing treatises on my reconstruction that I never read but knew existed because he'd referenced them during our sessions. I became famous in a narrow, specialized way. The survivor, the reconstruction, the successful integration of xenos modification with imperial baseline biology. They gave me a designation, Subject K-17, that appeared in medical texts and research papers. My original name became a footnote, barely relevant to what I'd become. After 7 years, they declared the reconstruction complete. Not successful, they were careful never to use that word, but complete. I was. Stable, viable, capable of independent function within parameters. Calixus 7 presented me with a mirror for the first time since my capture, and I looked at what I'd become. Mostly human, but wrong in ways both obvious and subtle. My proportions were off, my limbs slightly too long, my joints bending at angles that suggested more flexibility than human baseline allowed. My skin was scar tissue and graft work, patchwork covering the deeper modifications. My face was mine, but also not. They'd reconstructed it based on archival records, but the underlying bone structure had been too altered, and the result was something that resembled Commorragh, the way a sketch resembles its subject. My eyes were the worst. They'd kept the modifications to my eyes because reversal would have meant blindness, and even the Mechanicus drew lines at deliberately crippling their patients. So I retained vision that extended into spectra human eyes couldn't normally perceive, that processed light in ways that gave me information I didn't want. I could see in the dark. I could detect heat signatures. I could perceive electromagnetic fields. And when I looked at my own reflection, I could see the subtle wrongness that others might miss, but that I recognized immediately. I was alien, not Xenos, but no longer purely human either. Something in between, something unprecedented. They released me with restrictions. I would live under permanent inquisitorial observation, my location always known, my activities always monitored. I could not leave the designated containment world without explicit permission. I could not interact with the general population without supervision. I could not access restricted information or secured locations. I was free, technically, but it was a freedom so circumscribed that it barely qualified. They assigned me to a research station on the same moon where I'd been reconstructed. The Mechanicus wanted me close for ongoing study, and the Inquisition wanted me contained where I couldn't spread potential contamination. I was given quarters, basic amenities, and a work assignment, assisting with the analysis of other survivors, helping the tech priests understand modifications similar to my own, serving as a living reference text for xenobiology and reconstructive procedure. I see them sometimes, the new arrivals. They bring them in restrained and terrified, their bodies bearing the artistry of that nightmare city, their minds shattered by what they've experienced. I help where I can, explaining procedures, describing what reconstruction entails, offering what comfort someone like me can offer. They look at me and see their potential future, and I watch hope die in their eyes as they realize that survival might be worse than death would have been. 23 years have passed since the benediction of toil was taken. I am 49 years old by standard reckoning, though my modified biology ages differently, and the tech priests estimate my physiological age as closer to 60. I work, I exist, I serve the Omnissiah and the Emperor in the small ways permitted to someone like me. I have no friends. Who could befriend something like me? I have no future beyond this moon, this facility, this narrow existence of observation and utility. I dream of Commorragh sometimes, dream of my alcove, of his work chamber, of the amphitheater where he nearly completed me. I wake from these dreams uncertain whether they're nightmares or memories of some simpler time when my purpose was clear, even if it was terrible. I wake and look at my hands in the darkness, seeing them in spectra that humans shouldn't perceive, and I cannot say whether I'm grateful for rescue or resentful of survival. The Inquisitor who interviewed me all those years ago visits occasionally, checking on his decision to spare me. He's aged significantly, the work takes its toll, while I remain suspended in this artificial stability. He asks the same questions each time. Do I feel loyalty to the Imperium? Do I experience any compulsion to return to Commorragh? Do I dream of the Xenos who modified me? Do I hate them? I answer honestly, because lying to an Inquisitor is both impossible and pointless. Yes, I remain loyal, because what else is there? No, I don't wish to return, because that city is worse than death. Yes, I dream of him, the tall one, my captor and modifier. And no, I don't hate him. That last answer always troubles the Inquisitor. He wants hate. He wants righteous anger, desire for revenge, the clean narrative of victim opposing victimizer. But hate requires caring, requires emotional investment, requires acknowledgement of worth. I don't hate him because hating him would grant him significance. He was simply something that happened to me, a force like gravity or decay, as impersonal as plasma physics or orbital mechanics. What I feel is emptiness, a hollowness where Valenkoreth used to be, filled partially by this thing I've become but never completely. I am functional, I am stable, I am alive, but I am not whole, and I never will be again. Sometimes, in the deep hours when the facility runs on minimal staff and the surveillance is at its lowest intensity, I stand at the observation window in my quarters and look up at the stars. Somewhere out there is Commorragh, existing in the webway between realities, and somewhere in that city is my alcove in his gallery, presumably filled now with some other poor creature he's transformed into art. Sometimes I imagine he thinks of me, his interrupted masterwork, the project abandoned mid-creation when the Imperium came burning through his city. I imagine he feels frustration at the incompletion, artistic regret at the unfinished piece. But probably not. Probably I was just another subject, another canvas, immediately forgotten and replaced. Probably he's moved on to new projects, new victims, new expressions of his ancient, terrible craft. Probably I'm unique only to myself, significant only in my own narrow experience. That's the final lesson, the one I learned not in captivity but in freedom. Surviving doesn't mean winning. Rescue doesn't mean salvation. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen isn't death or transformation, but continuation, being forced to keep existing in a state that's neither alive nor dead, neither human nor xenos, neither free nor imprisoned. I am what they made me. The Imperium reconstructed my body but couldn't restore my humanity. The Mechanicus stabilized my biology but couldn't heal what was broken in my mind. The Inquisition granted me life but couldn't give me purpose beyond serving as a cautionary example. I am Subject K-17, formerly Enginseer 3rd Class Valen Korath, survivor of Drukhari captivity, successful reconstruction, permanent containment case. I am alive, and some days I can almost remember what that used to mean back when I stood on the forge deck of the Benediction of Toil and thought my small life was sufficient. I remember the light, that ordinary amber glow reflecting off brushed steel. I remember the weight of my wrench in my hand. I remember thinking I was safe. I remember everything, and I will never be free of those memories, and that, more than the modifications, more than the pain, more than the years of reconstruction, that is what it means to be captured by the Dark Eldar, not the suffering itself, but the after, the forever after, the endless existence in the shadow of what was done to you, carrying it forward through every moment of every day, unable to forget, unable to heal, unable to die. This is my testimony, this is my confession, this is what it's like. Emperor, preserve me, this is what it's like.